Thank you. Hello, everybody. Sorry for the late start. I was slightly annoying and thought there'd be water bottles in here and that sort of thing, so a bit parched. So, good afternoon. I'm Victoria Walberg, though most people online know me as Vicky Jo. I work as an interim security consultant. I run my own company, which is Logically Limited. The type of work I tend to do tends to be things such as interim security consultant, security manager, sometimes like security BA or PM. Depends what an organisation needs, and it's typically for the larger organisations, the multinationals and banks. So it might sound a bit of a vague title, and I'll talk a bit more about that later on. But the short version is I've been doing InfoSec related work for over 15 years. So the talk today is diversity in InfoSec, but it's not that sort. So the talk is in two parts. In part one, I'll use the OSI 7-layer model as a talking point around the diversities of areas of work, research, areas of concern across the InfoSec spectrum. It's a bit more techy, and in part two, Rockstars versus Plumbers, I'll talk about the work that enterprise security people do across the layers, and how this relates to Rockstar researchers, and a bit about security versus compliance. So with both parts, I want to provide a broad overview. For people who are new or thinking about entering the industry, but also for those who've been focused in specific areas of work or research. So a bit of background about why I've chosen to talk about this. So I go to lots of different types of cons and meetups. Sometimes I find that they can be quite siloed. The more techie ones like a B-Sides or Insomniac, thank you very much. They tend to quite often focus on things like malware and pen testing and reverse engineering and lots of things on research. And then I go to the OWASP events, and there's obviously a focus there on SDLC and DevSecOps and coding practices. And then I go to things and events run by something like IST Squared. Obviously, a big thank you to them today for sponsoring the event. And the similar sort of organisations to them. And there's more focus on enterprise security and in turn governance, risk and compliance. And it can be quite high level. So it can feel quite tribal at times. And that I'm split across these different events. So, part one, I'm going to use the OSI model. So, it will do. I'm about to change slides. So I tend to talk quite a lot, and then you get the odd slide, don't worry. So for those of you not familiar with the OSI model, there's a representation up there that's actually come from the dummies guides. And on the right-hand side, you've also got the TCP IP model across there. But I am going to play with the terminology and broaden the scope, and, I am going to take some liberties. So one of the reasons I'm using this as a starting point was I have a background of originally being a network engineer, sysadmin, web hosting. There's been a lot of roles where I've done a bit of everything, even did web dev for a short time. And in some ways things have changed over the years. There's been an evolution in tech generally. Roles tend to be a lot more focused. There are very few InfoSec roles where when I started out, and it tended to be bundled up as being part of, say, something like a network engineer or sysadmin. And now you find that companies look for people who are skilled, perhaps in things like a particular email server product rather than just being a sysadmin, or they want a sysadmin to have worked with a particular version of Linux rather than just Linux generally, and they want a network engineer who has certifications from a specific vendor. And you see the same with developer roles. And many other tech roles too, that they are a lot more focused today. And that's not forgetting that a lot of those things that I've just talked about have now moved to the cloud. So there are a larger variety of roles and technologies, and there are lots of things that exist now that didn't when I started, and there are lots of things that have gone away, more recently, Solaris, but there's many, many technologies that have died. So back to the OSI model. When I'm working as a security manager or consultant, I have to think about across all these layers and beyond. I will touch upon what's commonly referred to as layer 8 and people later on. But having a broad and diverse background can be really helpful in those sort of roles because you are having to think across such a wide range of technologies. So starting with physical, risks tend to be things like taps for nation states, but for most organisations it's going to be your typical things such as building access or some sort of disaster like fire and flood. And in terms of people trying to attack you, it's normally things like social engineering for building access or some form of deliberate damage or harm. That could be insider threat or somebody wanting to cause some damage to an organisation. For nation states, that is quite advanced. There is a lot more to be said, sort of, if you look at things like the TAPS, it does tend to be things like the Five Eyes programs. But a lot of the damage that comes is accidental or it's organisational failures. So in terms of defending against physical attacks, with building access, it's usually people, it's your security guards, there's sometimes some tech involved, like CCTV. And then in DCs, in data centres, you tend to have quite specific tech, so sensors, things like pressure pads, fire suppression systems, having in place things like backups and off-site locations. But typically, most of the physical security, the responsibility for this does sit with, say, a physical security team or facilities teams. But sometimes for the more specific IT areas, they will come and look for advice. So that could be on things such as data centres, or when you're thinking about data protection issues, such as using CCTV, which you do have to be registered for with the ICO. And those are the times you might be consulted. The other interesting bit, I think, that's come out recently in terms of physical attack are things like Rowhammer, using disturbance errors, and there you've got things like error checking to help mitigate that type of physical attack. If you're interested in more information on tapping, I have provided a link in the slides for that one. That's somebody setting up their own little home tap. But data, we're going to talk a lot more about this. It is seen as the crown jewels. It's what people are looking to get access to. It's what people are looking to defend. And this is the key bit. So particularly in the enterprise, they're looking to defend things like intellectual property, trade secrets, got all your HR data, or your financial data, things like payment processing, and then all your sales and marketing data as well. So there's a lot of data that general organisations are looking to protect. But also in healthcare and the public sector, data is quite literally vitally important. And then there's all the personal data that's now being hoovered up by things like social networks and e-commerce sites, or an information society service, as it's sometimes referred to. And it's that type of data that could be used by others for manipulation. So we've heard obviously recently about things around voting and manipulation for voting and referendums. But it can also be used for blackmail and extortion. Don't know how many people here have received those blackmail emails that have been doing the rounds. Send us some Bitcoin. We've seen you doing something a bit dodgy on your webcam. So why do people want data? I mean, aside from the standard day-to-day running of a business and making lots of money. So some people do legitimately want data for research. Nation states may want it, and obviously criminals are very, very interested in it. But as mentioned, it can be used for influencing political elections and referendums. It can also be used for corporate espionage. People have been in trouble, particularly in the US, for allegedly taking trade secrets with them when moving on to a new company. But at a more personal level, things like financial data can be sold and traded for money. There's been a lot of reports out saying, this is how much somebody is worth. If they've got all this extra information, it's worth a bit more money. There's normally in those articles lots of references to the dark web and that sort of thing. And obviously there's, again, back to the blackmail, also can be traded for money or political gain. So how do we defend that data? So whether that's keeping it private when it's intended to be private, or ensuring its integrity, or just making sure it's available for people when it's needed. So quite often a lot of it comes down to governance. It's things like having internal policies and standards. For most enterprises, they'll have some things like end user policies, technical standards on system configurations. There's also commercial standards out there such as PCI DSS. Obviously legal regulations, GDPR is around the corner. NIST has come in recently. And then there's industry certifications as well. You've got the international standards, particularly the ISO 27000 series. That is quite a bit more extensive than ISO 27001, which I suspect a lot of people have heard of. But it is much more than just an information security management system, and they can really get quite specific with those international standards. For example, ISO 27039 is security techniques, selection, deployment and operations of intrusion detection systems. So they can be very, very specific, including around technology. And you can use those ISO standards and get that certification to demonstrate that you've got a certain standard of control. So in terms of the regulatory controls, you do have specific ones for certain industries, and NIS only applies to operators of essential services. In the UK, the government has elected to exclude financial services from that for the time being. So in terms of risks and threats, there's data leakage. We've seen it happen time and time again, whether it's been a cyber attack, as the ICO like to refer to it, things like the TalkTalk breach, where there's been an actual technical attack, and then there's ones where there's been people abusing their privileges, which again was another one that TalkTalk was fined for quite recently, where a supplier of theirs had had access to a portal and had been able to scam customers of TalkTalk. And you may have heard more recently this week that the CPS have also been fined by the ICO as they've lost unencrypted DVDs with interviews with people of victims and alleged perpetrators of crimes. So there's quite a lot of personal information on there. But with the loss of this data, there's also a real impact on people. There's the potential for identity theft and financial loss. But lack of availability as well can have a major impact. We saw that last year with WannaCry and the unavailability of healthcare data, or people being unable to bank, as we've seen very recently with TSB. And again, the integrity of data, there's been a lot of questions raised around the integrity of the data of TSB, with people alleging that they can see incorrect information about their accounts. So all the technical controls that are put in to help mitigate the risks to data are typically there to support the business. The confidentiality, integrity and availability or regulatory aims of protecting that data and the business. But in a true OSI sense, just coming back to that model for a moment, you do have attacks which include MAC address and ARP spoofing, so there's a potential for loss of confidentiality and integrity within authorised use, and it can lead to session hijacking. You've got IP pool, DHCP starvation, which can lead to availability issues, and then things like spanning tree and VLAN hopping. If you're in Paco's talk earlier, I did hear him mention that these sort of attacks don't happen in the cloud. I hope I understood that correctly. But for threats to data in a generic sense, they're typically used, carried out using attacks at other layers. And sometimes in combination, so you might have some social engineering to enable an application layer attack, and I'll talk a bit more about those layers. And then in terms of defense, it's defense in depth. It does take more than one control or design to help defend that data, and that's a mix of, say, process and GRC controls, as well as having all your technical controls. Network. So in terms of attacks, OSI sense, you've got things like ping of death, routing, packet sniffing, IP spoofing, and your defense is what I would term sort of typical network technologies, firewalls, access control lists, source guard, having authentication. And things like encryption can help mitigate some of the attacks, such as packet sniffing. In a more general sense, attackers want to gain access to your network and gain a foothold to enable them to gather data. Transport. So with TCP traffic, the connection's established at the transport layer. So there's injection attacks, so there's man in the middle, Mitnick attacks, and you've got defences such as initial sequence numbers. They need to be difficult to predict. And then it's another one where you can use controls across multiple layers to mitigate the attack, such as using TLS to encrypt the traffic. So with attacks such as SYN flooding, you can use SYN cookies and opt-ACK attacks. Defense of that, you can use things like nonces. There is a really good PDF there. It's very in-depth. There's a lot of slides on it, but it's really interesting if you're interested in getting much more in-depth into network level attacks and defenses. So I've lumped session, presentation and application together. So for session and presentation layers, you've got things, protocols such as NetBIOS and SIP and RPC. And these protocols can be used to gain access to data And again, your typical defences are things like firewalls and patching, and again, using TLS to mitigate. But it's the application layer that tends to be a lot more interesting. So you've got your cross-site scripting, you've got your SQL injection attacks. These are certainly the very popular ones. In terms of threats, it's people using security scanning tools, whether they're more network security scanning tools, looking for things at a protocol level, or whether they're looking for things at an application layer. You have people occasionally doing unofficial pen testing. Normally happens after there's been some social media uproar, some social media team have said the wrong thing, and suddenly there's an awful lot of unofficial pen testing going on. And then you've got your malware and ransomware creators that are utilising the vulnerabilities. So in terms of risks at this layer, it's normally things like lack of design, it's misconfiguration across the layers, people make mistakes with designs, sometimes with applications. There's no design, a developer's just cracked on and built something. And there's quite often a lack of, if there's a lack of processes, so a lack of risk modelling, again, where people have been very enthusiastic and keen to build something, but they haven't thought about the threats. And sometimes it's having a lack of design and build documentation, and people building things in a different way and just expecting that there's know-how, doing the basics, such as turning off remote desktop services or keeping them configured to be restricted to within the bounds of your own network. Ideally, if you are going through these processes and having these design and build documents, second pair of eyes is always handy, and having some sort of oversight. That's a lot easier said than done, but it is easier in the larger organisations. But again, development problems, sometimes it's just a lack of awareness of what good coding practices are, or people just genuinely make a mistake. Sometimes mistakes and issues with the application layers slip through with a lack of testing as well. So in terms of defending against things at these layers, again, particularly with application, it's things like looking at robust design, data mapping, understanding what data you've got, understanding your data flows, having those threat modelling processes, having implementation and change control processes as well, can often be key. Secure coding if you're building your apps. But I also think it's important for there to be time made for continuing professional development and experience. And that isn't always training, but sometimes it's just having time and letting people have time and supporting people in gaining knowledge of new technologies and threats. So if you're wondering why I come to conferences, it's to help keep me aware of what's new, and that's the value that I find in coming to conferences. So whether that's understanding new threats or new defensive techniques. So testing and quality checking is something that I'm quite keen on. So it's things looking at, are things built to a design? Is the design robust? Are there new threats? So if you've made a change, has something new changed since your original design, and what's the impact of that? What if a change has an unwanted side effect? So a lot of basic testing can be automated, but I've worked with quite a few pen testers who've been here at Abate. So I am aware of how useful the manual testing can be, especially when you're looking at things that can't be just programmed in as a threat model and turned into automated testing. But more generally, in the industry, there are lots of security and malware researchers, so the likes of Google Project Zero, who are hopefully making discoveries before the black hats do, and also from the commercial vendors, who are doing all this research and helps give them a competitive advantage. I did mention the OWASP Top 10. If you just go to owasp.org, there's a lot there about the application security risks. This has recently been updated, but I have touched on some of those things, such as security misconfiguration. So, Layer 8, as it's started to be known, is the people aspect of security. So sometimes people do present risks, whether that's they misunderstand things, especially when it's technical things, and accidents do happen. Quite often there's no malicious intent. Seen it happen with accidental deletion, or perhaps users not realising that an email contains a virus. You've also got to be aware of malicious threats. They normally try and come in via social engineering. Others may have intents around bribery and blackmail. So in terms of defending against you for Layer 8, preventative measures, so you've got things like background checks. Those are required for particularly people working in things like financial services or government, to check that they're not at risk of blackmail or bribery. And more generally, you've got physical security at a site. Checking, are the people who are coming onto site who we think they are? Is somebody trying to gain access to the site that aren't authorised? So it's not just about people, but we can also use technical measures to help with defence of people making these mistakes. I know there's a bit of controversy around antivirus, but I'm a great believer in it. It can help with that combination of malicious attackers, whether that's a drive-by download, or your users accidentally triggering a virus via email. And backups can help, again, mitigate things like accidental deletions or corruptions through ransomware. Multi-factor authentication, I think, is really great as well for helping ensure that people are who they say they are, or that they've got the access. So education and training are great help for helping with that defence and supporting people. So it's helping users detect problems. What does a malicious email look like? Giving them good guidance on reporting and having that security culture in an organisation. So encourage that reporting rather than blaming, so that you can help mitigate and stop a problem rather than having it run its course and it being a much bigger disaster. Do people want to do questions now or right at the end? So if anybody's got any questions from part one. No. Okay, so that was a whistle-stop tour through looking at different technologies and various areas that tend to come into view with InfoSec. Part two is Rockstars versus Plumbers. So I mentioned earlier that I go to quite a few conferences and meetups and how they can feel quite siloed or tribal. And I have been asked about talks, and I have been quite hesitant about that. Mainly because I don't do cool stuff, and part of it is I can't. Most enterprise IT or security folks, whether they're ops or consultants, they can't talk about their day-to-day work. It normally presents risks, whether that's security, that you're talking too much and exposing what your internal processes are, or it's a reputational risk. You can't really say, this bad thing happened here. It doesn't always reflect well on employers or clients. But there are times when I go to a con, and sometimes the reaction from some researchers can be a bit like that. And there are times when I go to the more formal cons. Oh, those were backwards. And it's a bit more like that. But it isn't the case for everyone. There are lots of really great people in InfoSec. There's some really great techies within what you would call typical enterprise organisations. And there are lots of really great researchers sharing their knowledge and time, whether that's people presenting at conferences like this, or B-sides, or running workshops. I've been really fortunate to go to things such as Black Hoodie. But back to enterprise security, it can be very, very broad. It's everything from securing your physical environment, meeting SLAs, managing risk, applying controls, vulnerability management, raising awareness, getting and maintaining compliance. That's often a big one. Governance, incident and crisis management, detection, root cause analysis, systems, apps, patching. There's a whole mix. It's really, really broad, and often you do end up wearing a lot of hats. There's an overview there from Utah State in the US, and this is their view of an enterprise information security program. They've touched upon some of the areas that I've spoken about earlier, but you can see it's pretty broad. It's not sexy work, but it is important work. And it's not just the traditional enterprise IT stack that we're having to think about anymore. There's all the online services, e-commerce and marketing, working with digital companies, it's exposing your footprint and extending that footprint, working directly with developers. You've got your hosting, your SaaS and your cloud providers. And then we're seeing more and more moving to digital apps and Internet of Things as brands try to be innovative, or they're expected and now mandated to provide online services in the government space. And information society services, to borrow a phrase from the EU. So how does all this relate to security researchers? And that includes pen testers, and the type of people you see speaking at more technical conferences or in the media. So, depending on the security researchers, whether that is people, doing reversing, working for antivirus companies, working with managed security service providers, or having major security vulnerabilities exposed by the likes of Project Zero. It all helps highlight risks, such as using service providers like Cloudflare, or the importance of patching, as we found with Heartbleed, or even how difficult it can be to be secured by design with things like Spectre and Meltdown. So all that research does help, I think, really highlight some of the risks and the threats to the enterprise. I think the other thing to bear in mind that is Mike Kanovisky of Adaptive Path said, your customers are not like you. They don't look like you. They don't think like you. They don't do the things that you do, and they don't have your expectations or assumptions. If they did, they wouldn't be your customers, they'd be your competitors. So for people in enterprise security, they have different priorities, and they're there to support a business. So they have different challenges from people in research space. They might not have support from the business to do the right thing, whatever that might be. That might be patching, secure by design, or just hiring better coders. On the whole, security teams do want to have good network and application security. And researchers do help keep enterprises safe through having products and services that they offer. And those vulnerabilities exposed can help secure more support from the business for the work that we do. Which does bring me on to compliance. It's not only exposing vulnerabilities that can help enterprise security folk gain support from the business. Compliance programs can help too. I know there are lots of different opinions on security versus compliance. I think everyone's in agreement here with Talis that compliance doesn't equal security, but I do share the view of Redspin that there is some overlap there. So the compliance standards I spoke about earlier, things like ISO 27001 and PCI DSS, require some of the basics, such as patching and user management, to carried out. So it's more often it's getting the basics right rather than having all your shiny blinky light boxes that help most organisations stay secure. So for researchers, sometimes products such as antivirus and services, so things like having a SOC and pen testing, they're brought on board and they're deployed because they're part of an organisation adhering to compliance standards. So my advice to enterprise security and GRC folk is if you meet someone who isn't suited and booted or don't look how you think they should look, please don't write them off as some weird geek who doesn't understand business or enterprise security or governance, risk and compliance. Don't get all enterprise rockstar either and dismiss people doing what some perceive as lowly tech work or that it's just for kids. So I think a lot more people in the enterprise space should go to a lot more tech events. So why go to those tech events outside your day-to-day work, and what value does it bring? So I think it helps keep tech skills sharp, helps gain insight and understanding about emerging threats and how this relates to environment, and have a think about updating your risk models. And I think for enterprise people, it also gives a sense of the work and effort that goes into security products and the services that are offered. And also it helps you consider why you might go for one product or service over another. And depending on your organisation, why you can't run it all in-house and why sometimes it is better to outsource. It can also help attune your snake oil sensor. But I also think that learning something new can be fun and interesting, and it could even pique your interest and have a change in focus or role. So my advice to researchers is if you meet an enterprise security or compliance person at a tech conference, please don't write them off. They may have more tech skills than you realise. And there are some people, particularly at large companies, who have very technical people working at them. And the fact that they're just there at a conference shows they're interested in learning. The other thing to consider is there's no magic money tree. So unless you're in a really privileged position to be an independent security researcher, the chances are you're either in academia or possibly self-funded or being comparatively underpaid, and you may look for private sector work in the future. Or you're working for a company that offers security services, whether that's pen tester for hire, or you're part of a large consultancy, or MSSP. So your salary, if you're in those sorts of organisations, is funded by enterprise security teams, buying something your company offers, whether that's a product you've been involved in developing, or skill or service that's perhaps part of an outsourced SOC or pen testing assignment. It also gives you an opportunity to meet your users and customers. So my advice to all is whatever type of InfoSecer you are, in the words of Will Wheaton, don't be a dick. Okay, questions? I just all bored you.